When I was a kid, my parents would sometimes drop me off at my aunt and uncle's farm for the weekend. It was a quiet, open place, tucked far enough from the city that the nights seemed darker and the air felt somehow heavier. Most of the time, I'd hang out with my two cousins, both around my age, and together we'd lose ourselves in the kind of reckless freedom only kids on a farm could know. Their property stretched out in every direction, wide fields and rustling trees giving us all the space we could ask for. We were free to run, explore, and get into trouble as long as we stayed out of sight when doing it. And we took full advantage of that. Sometimes, when the mood struck and we thought no one would notice, we'd sneak off past the edge of their land to the neighboring farm about half a mile down the dirt road. That place had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. A cluster of rotting buildings still stood on the property, some half collapsed, others leaning like they might finally give up and fall at any moment. Windows were either shattered or completely blackened with grime, and weeds had choked out the paths that once connected everything. To three curious boys looking for an adventure, it was a gold mine.
What made it even better, or worse, depending on how you looked at it, were the stories. My cousins were the first to share them, always in hushed tones after the adults had gone to bed, voices dropping just enough to give the words an eerie weight. They told me about a man who had lived there, a man who, one day, lost his mind, took an axe to his entire family, every last one of them. Afterward, he hung himself from a beam in the attic. But death, they said, didn't end his rage. He still returned each night, a furious spirit trapped in the ruins, searching for new victims. Classic stuff, bloody, over the top, the kind of tale meant to stick in your mind long after the sun had gone down. Even at that age, I had enough sense to know it was probably just a story, maybe a twisted version of some old rumor passed down and reshaped over time. But when I stood at the edge of that ruined farm, the wind stirring the high grass, the windows like hollow eyes watching us, I let myself believe it, just a little. Because in that place, surrounded by decay and silence, even the most far-fetched story suddenly felt possible. One quiet afternoon, we decided to play hide and seek, our go-to game when boredom crept in and the weather was too still to ignore. When it was my turn to hide, I didn't hesitate. I bolted straight for a worn-out brown barn near the edge of the abandoned property, the one with a set of narrow stairs that led up to what looked like old living quarters. I'd had my eye on it before, curious but never brave enough to explore it alone. Until now. I climbed the groaning wooden steps, each one creaking beneath my weight like it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, the air was dry and stale, laced with the faint scent of mold and something more metallic, something I couldn't quite place. Furniture still stood, barely, in its original places. A chair with one leg snapped in half, a table layered with dust thick enough to leave finger trails. Personal items were scattered across the warped wooden floor, as if whoever had lived there had vanished in the middle of their day. Broken dishes, faded clothes, and crumbling books littered the path ahead of me as I carefully picked my way through the space. Eventually, I found a small side room tucked away in the corner. It had a narrow closet, half open, and still lined with old, long black dresses swaying slightly as if disturbed by a breeze I couldn't feel. Jackpot. Without wasting time, I stepped inside and gently pulled the folding doors shut behind me, though they resisted and rattled on their tracks. I had to force them shut, careful not to make too much noise. My only source of light was a narrow blade of sunlight slicing through the crack between the doors from a nearby window. It lit up a thin line on the dusty floor, just enough for me to see my knees as I tucked them tightly to my chest and crouched down, still as a statue. And then I waited. Time passed. A lot of it, or at least it felt that way. I stayed silent, barely daring to breathe, listening for footsteps or the creak of the floorboards, any sign that someone was close. But nothing came. I waited longer. The stillness began to stretch unnaturally. No footsteps, no voices, not even the sound of the wind outside. I started to wonder if they'd forgotten I was playing. A strange sort of emptiness settled around me, the kind that makes you aware of your heartbeat, of the way your breath sounds too loud in your ears. Eventually, I started to debate whether I should just give myself up. The game had clearly gone on too long. My legs were aching, and I was starting to feel more foolish than clever. Then, my head drooped. I must have drifted off. I jolted awake with a sharp inhale. Everything was black. For a second, I couldn't remember where I was. The air felt heavier, warmer. My limbs were stiff from staying curled up for so long, and my thoughts moved sluggishly as I tried to gather myself. And then, bit by bit, it came back. The game, the barn, the closet, and the chilling realization that it was no longer daytime. It was night. The single sliver of sunlight that had illuminated my hiding spot was gone, swallowed by darkness. I couldn't see my hands in front of me, couldn't hear anything outside the closet. Not the wind, not the laughter of my cousins, not even the distant hum of insects that usually came alive at dusk. Just thick, unnatural silence. The barn had gone still, and I was still here, abandoned. A cold dread began to pool in the pit of my stomach, spreading slowly like ink in water. That closet, once a hiding spot in a game, now felt like a cage. The air felt tighter, and suddenly, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. I tried to stand, but the moment I shifted, a sharp cramp knotted deep in my calf, locking my leg in place. Pain surged up through the muscle, and I clenched my jaw, squirming in the cramped dark, waiting desperately for it to ease. My limbs were stiff from sitting so long, my knees sore and tingling, and the air inside the closet had gone stale and hot. That's when I heard it. A door slamming shut downstairs. I froze, every muscle tensing at once. Was that one of my cousins? Silence followed, long and unnatural. My ears strained, picking up nothing but the thudding of my own heartbeat in the tight space. And then, footsteps, slow, echoing from the bottom of the staircase. But not just footsteps. There was something else, a thud, heavy and dull, following every other step, like the sound of a weight being shifted, something dragged or burdened. And these weren't the steps of a child. No quick, careless scuffing, no light pitter-patter of sneakers. These were slow, heavy, deliberate. My breath caught in my throat, and I didn't dare move. I pressed myself against the back of the closet, heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Whoever, whatever, was down there had started climbing the stairs, each step creaking under a weight that didn't feel familiar. Then
silence again. A moment passed, and then the walking resumed. But this time it was accompanied by a new sound, a low, harsh scraping, steady and mechanical, as if something rough and weighty was being dragged along the wooden floorboards. It followed the footsteps as they wandered from room to room, closer, then further, with no real pattern. I stayed completely still, barely daring to blink. And then, beneath the creeping dread that filled the air, I noticed something else. A smell. Faint, but wrong. It had a sour, rotting edge to it, like meat left out in the sun or something dead just beginning to decay. It curled into my nose and made my stomach tighten. The scraping continued, relentless, like fingernails across a chalkboard, but heavier, more primal. Cold shivers crawled across my skin, racing down my arms and curling at the base of my spine. And then the footsteps reached the bedroom doorway. They paused. The dragging sound stopped. I bit down on my lips so hard it almost bled, willing myself to disappear into the darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to stay quiet, to not breathe, to become invisible. The steps came closer and closer, and then they stopped, right outside the closet door. I couldn't see a thing. The inside of the closet was pitch black now. I didn't know how close they were, how many inches or centimeters separated me from whatever stood just beyond the door. There was a long pause, a stillness that made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell how long it lasted. Seconds? Minutes? Longer? But it stretched out like it might never end. Then, at last, the footsteps began again. They moved away, slowly, crossing to the other side of the room. The dragging sound followed, scraping lightly over the floorboards. The steps passed through the doorway and out into the hall, gradually fading into the distance. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Even though they were gone, for now, the terror hadn't left with them. It was still in the room, in the air, seeping through the wooden slats of the closet. And I was still trapped inside. I waited. Minutes passed, maybe more. It felt like an eternity. No more sounds, no more footsteps, just silence. A silence so thick and absolute, it pressed in around me like a second skin. I stayed crouched, frozen in the dark, trying to summon the courage to open the closet door and run, just run, anywhere, away from this place. My hand hovered near the handle, trembling. My mind whispered that it might be safe now, that whatever had been there was gone. And then, 3 things happened at once. First came the smell. It hit me like a wave, sharp, wet, and wrong. It was the unmistakable stench of something freshly killed. Not just rot, fresh death. Warm, metallic. Like roadkill under a summer sun, split open and steaming. Next, I heard it. Breathing. Low, raspy, uneven. Inside the closet, right behind me. And then I felt it. Hot breath brushed across the back of my neck, so close that the hairs on my skin rose in panic. It was humid, foul, and unmistakably real. That was all it took.
I exploded out of the closet in blind panic, throwing myself forward with a scream caught in my throat. My shoulder hit the door as I shoved through, heart hammering, limbs already moving before my mind could catch up. I bolted into the dark, relying on scattered fragments of memory and the faintest trace of moonlight bleeding through the broken windows to guide me. Behind me? Footsteps. Fast, heavy, close. They pounded across the floor, growing louder with each second. Whatever it was chasing me, closing the distance with terrifying speed. My escape was chaos. I crashed into walls, stumbled over fallen debris, slammed into door frames. Splinters scraped across my arms. My knee cracked against something hard. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I tore through the hallway, breath ragged and shallow, muscles screaming. Every second felt like I was one step from being grabbed, from something unseen dragging me backward into the dark. But I kept going, driven by sheer animal panic. Only when I burst through the front door, slamming it open so hard it rebounded off the frame, did I dare glance behind me. And nothing. No footsteps, no shadow, no figure looming in the doorway. The porch was empty. The house stood silent. But I didn't stop to wonder. I didn't wait. I didn't breathe. I ran. I ran like hell, all the way across the field, through the tall grass and dark open space, until the familiar glow of my aunt and uncle's porch light appeared in the distance like a beacon. I didn't stop until I reached it. Didn't stop until I was inside. And even then, the smell still clung to me. The breath still ghosted across my skin. And the silence of that closet still echoed in my ears. When I finally made it back, breathless and shaking, a police cruiser was parked in the driveway. Its flashing lights cast eerie red and blue pulses over the front of my aunt and uncle's house, throwing strange shadows across the porch. My parents were there too, faces pale, eyes wide with panic. The moment they saw me, they rushed forward, wrapping me in a flurry of frantic words and tighter than usual embraces. Everyone was talking at once. "Where have you been? Are you hurt? Do you know how long we've been looking for you?" Apparently, when my cousins hadn't found me by evening, they'd finally returned home, expecting maybe I'd come back on my own. When I didn't, their parents were told. And eventually, the police were called. They said they'd already searched every building on the property. Everyone. I was told this gently, but there was an edge beneath it. A subtle tension. The kind that said, they didn't quite believe me. The kind that said, you weren't there. The implication hung in the air. I was lying. Or mistaken, or maybe I'd wandered off somewhere else and imagined the whole thing. After all, they'd searched that barn, top to bottom. But nothing about what had happened made any sense, to me most of all. Years passed. The memory never left me, though I stopped talking about it. No one brought it up again, and life moved on. But then, much later, one of my cousins, older now, quieter, told me something he'd never shared before. We were alone, just the two of us, talking about old times, and that day came up, like it always eventually did. He said they had spent hours searching for me, just like they told the adults. That part was true. But what they'd never told anyone else, not their parents, not the police, was what they saw that made them stop looking. He and his brother had circled back toward the barn one last time. Just before giving up, they thought they saw me in the upstairs window of the bedroom I had been hiding in. Except, it wasn't me. A boy was standing there, a boy neither of them recognized. Young, pale, smiling. He was waving at them. Then he began gesturing, beckoning them to come upstairs. That's when they ran. Straight home. No questions, no second glances, just raw, instinctive fear. And all of that happened while I was asleep in the closet. A few months ago, I was hanging out at my friend's house, just a few doors down the block. That's pretty much where I spent most of my time, since nearly all of my friends lived somewhere along that same stretch of road. I'm 16 now, the second oldest in our little neighborhood crew. There's Alan, who's 17, Dan, who's in the same grade as me, though he's a bit younger. Then there's Johnny and Daniela, both 14, Nick's 13, and Tom's the youngest at 12. Yeah, there's a decent age gap between some of us, but we didn't care. We were really the only group of kids left on the block, and over time, we just kind of formed this loose, unofficial gang. Dan and I were the closest, best friends really. We had started hanging out years ago, and eventually met the rest of the kids from around the area. The group just came together naturally. There wasn't much else going on out here, so we made our own fun. Somehow, it turned into a regular thing. Every Friday night, without fail, we'd all gather around Daniela and Nick's place and play a massive game of manhunt. It became tradition. Now, we don't live in a typical suburban neighborhood, not like the ones with tidy cul-de-sacs and kids on bikes. Our area is more spread out. Big yards, wooded patches between properties, fewer houses, and fewer people. Not much really happened out here. And maybe that's what made the game so good. There was a kind of wildness to the space. Dark corners and old fences, places to hide that felt just dangerous enough to be thrilling. That particular Friday, it was our turn to hide first. I had 3 other kids on my team, but what really mattered was that Dan was with me. We made a good team, always did. We headed straight for Mr. Nelson's place, the old man who used to live next door. He'd passed away a few years ago, and since then, no one had touched the property. No buyers, no renovations, just an empty, forgotten house sitting there behind a rusting fence, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Overgrown grass, warped siding, windows stained with years of dust and weather. Perfect for what we needed. Dan and I slipped onto the back end of the property, where a quiet lake sat like a mirror behind the trees. It was peaceful back there, almost too quiet. But it was also far from the others, shadowed by thick branches, with patches of tall bushes scattered along the edge of the water. Perfect for what we needed. We found one of those clusters, dense, leafy, and low to the ground, and ducked inside. It was the perfect spot, hidden, remote, out of sight. We crouched down, catching our breath, exchanging a quiet laugh at how good this hiding spot was. The air smelled like damp earth and lake water. The branches above rustled just enough to remind you the night breeze was moving. It was quiet, still, too still. But at the time, we didn't think anything of it. Not yet. Dan, being Dan, wanted to take things up a notch. He grinned at me, whispered something about doing something crazy, and before I could stop him, he slipped away from the bushes and crept toward the old house. He found a sliding window that was cracked open, barely, and eased it the rest of the way before climbing inside. Just like that, he was gone. I stayed crouched low in the bushes, waiting. The rules of manhunt were simple. Make it back to Nick's house. That was home base. But half the game was all about hiding, waiting for the perfect moment to move. And so I waited, alone. It felt like forever, but it was probably only about 5 minutes before I saw 2 kids from the other team creeping into the backyard, scanning the shadows. They weren't exactly subtle, cracking twigs under their feet, whispering way too loudly. It was clear they didn't know where we were yet. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, they lost interest and kept moving, heading further down the block, away from me. Perfect. This was the window. I peeked out from the bushes, scanning the house, looking for any sign of Dan. I expected him to be near one of the ground floor windows, or maybe peeking out from the side, ready to bolt. But nothing. My eyes drifted upward to the 2nd floor, and that's when I saw him. His face, in the upstairs window, just his head, barely visible in the reflection glass, staring down at me. Relief washed over me. I stood and waved, big, obvious gestures, motioning him to come on. It was time to go, but he didn't move. He just stared. I waved again, more urgently this time. Still nothing. For a second, I wondered, could he even see me? The light wasn't great. Maybe the glare was blocking his view. I figured he might need a push, so I made my way over to the same window he had used to enter the house, slid it open, and climbed inside. The air was musty and stale, the kind of heavy, unmoved atmosphere that clings to abandoned spaces. Dust floated in the moonlight like ash. Floorboards creaked under my weight. "Dan?" I called out, voice echoing softly into the empty stillness. And then, from just a few feet away, "Dude, shh!" My whole body went stiff. I turned, and there was Dan, crouched near the base of the staircase, his eyes wide and alert. I blinked at him. "Wait, how did you get downstairs so fast?" He looked at me, confused. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. "I've been down here the whole time." Something cold slid down my spine. We both turned at the same time, eyes lifting upward toward the ceiling. Creak. A slow, deliberate shift of weight from the floor above. Neither of us said a word. We didn't have to. We bolted. Out the same window, crashing through the bushes and tearing down the block, lungs burning and legs pumping. We didn't stop until we reached Nick's house. Once everyone had gathered, we called the game off. No one asked questions. No one wanted answers. And I never looked up at that window again. The next day, still rattled and unable to shake the image of that face in the upstairs window, we decided to ask Dan's dad if anyone had recently moved in to the old Nelson house. Maybe, just maybe, someone had finally bought the place without anyone noticing. A stretch, but we needed it to make sense. Dan's dad was firm. No one had lived there in 3 years. He was certain. In fact, he seemed genuinely surprised that we were even asking. But when we told him what had happened, leaving out a few of the creepier details, he didn't laugh it off. He just went quiet. Then he said, "All right, Let's go take a look. So the four of us, me, Dan, Alan, and Dan's dad, walked back over to the Nelson property. The sun was just starting to go down again, and the house didn't look any less abandoned than it had the night before. We entered through the same sliding window, just like Dan had. The place felt colder this time, somehow emptier, though nothing had changed. Dan's dad took the lead. He knew the house well, having been good friends with Mr. Nelson back in the day. He moved with a kind of quiet familiarity, stepping carefully over debris and warped floorboards as he led us upstairs. We stopped at the bathroom. The one with the window. The same window where I'd seen something, staring down at me the night before. Dan's dad flicked on the overhead light. The bulb buzzed faintly before casting a pale yellow glow over the room. It was empty, except for one thing. A crumpled blanket lay on the floor, reddish-brown, tattered, stained. It looked like it hadn't been touched in a long time. The room was otherwise bare. No signs of life, no footprints, no open drawers or recently disturbed dust. Just silence, stillness. We continued searching the house, room by room. Every hallway, every closet, even the attic. There was nothing, no signs that anyone had been there. No evidence of movement or recent occupation. Just dust, old furniture, and the hum of time standing still. Dan's dad didn't try to make sense of it. After we finished checking the last room, he just stood there for a moment, brow furrowed, hands on his hips. Then he turned to us and said quietly, "If any of us, anyone, ever sees something or someone in this house again, we call the police immediately. No games, no waiting." That was it. It's been a few months now. Nothing strange has happened since. No more games at the Nelson house. No more faces in windows. Just quiet. But still, I know someone else was in that house that night, and it wasn't Dan.